Stalingrad burned in September 1942, and the German Sixth Army had torn through the city like a chainsaw through flesh. Buildings that once housed 500,000 people stood as tombstones of concrete and twisted steel, and the Volga River ran red with blood. Adolf Hitler had made his intentions clear, stating that this city, named after his greatest enemy, had to fall. A man lay perfectly still in the skeleton of a destroyed apartment block, and he'd been there for 6 hours without moving, without blinking. His Mosin-Nagant rifle rested against a chunk of concrete with no scope attached, just iron sights. 800 meters away, 2 German soldiers stepped into a doorway, and most men wouldn't even attempt what came next because the distance was too far and the rifle too basic. But this man wasn't most men. His rifle cracked once across the ruins, and the first German dropped. 3 seconds later came a second shot, and the second soldier fell. A Soviet officer witnessed what seemed impossible, approached the motionless figure in the rubble, and asked one question. "Who the hell are you?" The man stood up while dust fell from his shoulders and his eyes looked like ice. "Vasily Zaitsev, sir, clerk from the Pacific Fleet." The officer stared at the 2 bodies 800 meters distant, then back at Zaitsev. "Not anymore. Get this man a sniper rifle." This is the story of Vasily Zaitsev, the sniper who turned Stalingrad into a death trap. Understanding the man who would become the Soviet Union's deadliest sniper means understanding where he came from. And Vasily Grigorievich Zaitsev came from one of the harshest places on earth. March 23, 1915 marked his birth in the village of Yelenovsk, deep in the Ural Mountains. And this wasn't just rural Russia, but Siberia itself, where temperatures drop so low your breath freezes midair, where wolves hunt in packs, and where survival itself counts as a daily accomplishment. Peasants with no money and no market to buy food made up Vasily's family, which meant if you wanted to eat, you hunted. And if you hunted, you couldn't waste bullets. His grandfather understood this better than anyone, and when Vasily grew barely tall enough to shoulder a rifle, the old man handed him a massive single-barrel Berdan rifle so heavy the boy could barely carry it on his back. What his grandfather said next stayed with Vasily forever. "One shot, one kill. Bullets are precious. You make it count." The endless Siberian forest called the taiga became Vasily's childhood home, where he spent days in the snow tracking wolves and deer with his younger brother. Nights freezing in makeshift shelters taught him patience, and long hours of stillness taught him to read the forest like other children read books. 12 years old when he brought home his first trophy, a wolf taken with one shot, one kill. Most boys his age were playing games, while Vasily Zaitsev learned how to hunt the most dangerous predators on the planet. And he didn't know it yet, but he was training for a very different kind of hunt where the prey would shoot back. 22 years old in 1937, Vasily had left the mountains, studied construction and accounting in Magnitogorsk, and joined the Soviet military, but not as a soldier. The Pacific Fleet stationed him in Vladivostok, thousands of miles from home, where he pushed papers in the finance department balancing books and filing reports. The accountant's life meant nothing to him, and Vasily hated every second of it. June 22, 1941 changed everything when Operation Barbarossa launched, and 3 million Nazi soldiers poured across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. Cities burned while millions fled, and the Red Army collapsed. But Vasily Zaitsev, master hunter and trained marksman with a warrior spirit, sat stuck behind a desk. Transfer requests to the front lines came back denied, then denied again, then denied a third time. 5 times Zaitsev begged to join the fight, and 5 times his superiors said no. September 1942 brought the change when Germans started hammering a city on the Volga River, a critical industrial center and transportation hub that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Stalingrad was dying, and the Red Army had grown desperate enough to need every man who could hold a rifle, which meant Vasily's transfer finally got approved. A September night in 1942 found Vasily Zaitsev crossing the Volga River on a transport boat under constant German fire, with bullets sparking off the water and shells exploding around them while men died before reaching the shore. When Vasily stepped onto the West Bank, he looked up at what remained of Stalingrad and made a vow that would echo through history. "For us, there is no land beyond the Volga. We will stand to the death." How literal those words would become, he had no idea. Yet recalling Stalingrad a battle fails to capture the scale, the brutality, the absolute unrelenting horror that unfolded there. Summer 1942 saw Hitler's forces having conquered most of Europe after crushing Poland, France, and the Low Countries, before driving deep into Soviet territory. But Hitler wanted more than victory. He wanted humiliation. Stalingrad, the city named after Joseph Stalin, his ideological arch-enemy, became an obsession, where taking it wasn't just strategic, but personal. Hitler told his generals that they would take Stalingrad and would not leave, while Stalin responded with Order 227, not one step back, where retreat meant execution, cowardice meant execution, and surrender was not an option. Two dictators with two egos stood opposed, and caught between them. 1,000,000 men were about to die in the bloodiest urban battle in human history. August 23, 1942, brought hell when the Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of German bombers that turned Stalingrad into an inferno, and entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. The bombing ran so intense that the city's river port, the oil refineries, and residential districts simply ceased to exist, killing 40,000 civilians in the initial assault. Survivors found themselves trapped in a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet, a dead planet. But here's the thing about destroying a city: you don't make it easier to conquer, you make it perfect for defenders. Every pile of rubble became a fortress, while every shattered building turned into a sniper's nest, and every basement became a bunker. And the Germans had superior tanks, in superior air power, superior numbers. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, none of that mattered as much as a man with a rifle who knew how to wait. Mid-September arrival found the situation desperate when Vasily Zaitsev reached the city, because Germans controlled 90% of Stalingrad, while Soviet forces clung to narrow strips along the western bank of the Volga, some positions less than 100 meters deep. Reinforcements crossed the river at night under fire, with many drowning or dying before reaching shore, and the average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad measured 24 hours. Zaitsev didn't care because he'd come to fight, and his first weeks saw him fighting as a regular infantryman, with hand-to-hand combat in bombed-out apartments and bayonet charges through factory floors. What, a bayonet wound couldn't make him leave the line, but his commanders noticed something about this accountant from Vladivostok. He could shoot, and shoot really well. The breakthrough came when German positions pinned down a group of Soviet soldiers, and two Germans appeared in a window 800 meters away. Most soldiers wouldn't even attempt the shot, but Zaitsev, using just a standard-issue Mosin-Nagant rifle without a telescopic sight, fired twice, and both Germans fell. His regimental commander witnessed it and immediately understood what he had, because this wasn't just a good shot, but something special. 40 German soldiers died between September the 22nd and October 19th from Vasily Zaitsev's standard-issue rifle, 40 confirmed kills in less than a month without a scope. The Red Army awarded him the Medal for Bravery and finally gave him what he needed: a Mosin-Nagant model 1891/30 with a PU 3.5 times telescopic sight. And now the real work could begin. Stalingrad's ruins created a sniper's paradise where the German blitzkrieg, designed for open terrain and rapid movement, had ground to a halt in the rubble. Tanks couldn't navigate the debris, Stukas couldn't distinguish friend from foe when both sides were separated by a single wall, and soldiers trained for lightning warfare found themselves in a grinding, claustrophobic nightmare, where death came from nowhere. Vasily Zaitsev turned that nightmare into an art form by hiding in water pipes, buried in rubble, perched in the skeletal remains of apartment buildings, sometimes even concealed beneath the bodies of dead soldiers. Patience learned from hunting wolves in Siberia now applied to hunting men, and he would lie motionless for 6, 8, 10 hours, waiting for a single shot that always proved fatal when it came. But Zaitsev wasn't just killing, he was thinking, analyzing, perfecting his craft. A philosophy of sniping developed that would influence military doctrine for the next 80 years, and he later wrote about his methods in his memoir, where these principles became the foundation of Soviet sniper training. Walking through the mind of a killer reveals what made him so effective. Never staying in one place formed his first principle, because a sniper operates as a nomad who moves after 2 or 3 shots, always, and predictability means death. The moment the enemy knows where you are, you're already dead, and which meant Zaitsev would have 3 or 4 positions prepared in advance and move between them like a ghost. Total invisibility came second, where camouflage wasn't optional, but religion. Zaitsev learned to avoid shooting toward the setting sun because light could reflect off his scope and give away his position. But he loved the morning sun because it would glint off enemy binoculars and scopes to reveal their locations. Students learned to lie absolutely still, to control their breathing, to become part of the landscape. Lie like a stone, he would say, and merely observe. This is a war of nerves, his third principle stated, because patience beats speed every time. Zaitsev would create distractions, use decoys, and exhaust the enemy's ability to concentrate, and he'd watch enemy snipers for days learning their patterns, their habits, their mistakes. Recognizing the handwriting of different German snipers came from just observing their tactics, he said. The dummy technique showed his brilliance in the fourth principle, where Zaitsev would set up a dummy like a helmet on a stick or a fake head near his position. Enemy snipers would shoot at it and reveal their location, or better yet, Zaitsev would let the enemy get used to the dummy and become careless about it before swapping positions with it. Suddenly, the dummy becomes the sniper, and the sniper becomes the executioner. One shot, one kill formed the fifth principle, where firing without absolute certainty was forbidden because every shot reveals your position. Wasted bullets aren't just wasted bullets, but death sentences, and Zaitsev's grandfather had taught him this with wolves. Yes, but it applied even more to men with rifles trying to kill you back. But perhaps Zaitsev's most revolutionary contribution came with what he called the sixes, and instead of operating alone, Zaitsev developed a group hunting tactic. 3 positions with 2 men at each point, 1 sniper and 1 scout, made 6 men total coordinating their fire and movement to cover a large area. Silent communication allowed them to create crossfires and support each other, and this tactic is still used by Russian forces today because it was implemented during the Chechen Wars. The sixes turned sniping from an individual art into a team sport, and the results were devastating. Working closely with his spotter, a man named Nikolai Kulikov, created an inseparable partnership. Kulikov would observe, calculate distances, read wind conditions, and identify targets while Zaitsev would shoot. And together they were unstoppable because trust wasn't just important, but survival itself. 225 enemy soldiers died between October 10th and December 17th, 1942 from Vasily Zaitsev's rifle, and that's 225 confirmed kills in just over 2 months. 11 of them were enemy snipers, and each death got documented, verified, and recorded. German officers were worth more points because killing them disrupted command structures, but enemy snipers counted as crown jewels because eliminating an enemy sniper didn't just remove a threat, but sent a psychological message that nowhere is safe. And that's when the legend arrived, the story that would define Zaitsev's life and blur the line between history and mythology forever. The duel with Major König. Soviet accounts claim the Germans were terrified because their soldiers were dying in Stalingrad, and many of those deaths came from a single man whose name whispered among German ranks like a ghost story, Vasily Zaitsev. The Wehrmacht did what any military would do when facing an unstoppable threat. They sent their best. Major König, allegedly the head of a sniper school in Berlin, arrived with a simple mission to kill Zaitsev and break Soviet morale. Late November 1942 saw the duel reportedly lasting 3 days somewhere in the ruins near the Red October factory, and it was chess played with bullets. König showed patience and discipline without revealing himself while Zaitsev and Kulikov searched for him, studied the terrain, and tried to anticipate his position. And 2 of Zaitsev's comrades got shot, wounded, but not killed, because König was sending a message. The 3rd day brought a glint of light beneath a sheet of metal that Zaitsev noticed, barely visible, and it could be glass or could be a scope. Kulikov had an idea, and he slowly, carefully raised a helmet on a stick just above the edge of their cover. König fired, and the helmet fell. Some accounts say Kulikov even screamed to make it sound like he'd been hit, and König, thinking he'd won, raised his head just slightly to confirm the kill. That's when Zaitsev shot him. 1 bullet through the head. Darkness came before they crawled to König's position, retrieved his papers and rifle scope, and delivered them to their divisional commander as a trophy, as proof, as victory. The story works well except for one problem. It probably never happened. British historian Sir Anthony Beevor examined Russian Ministry of Defense archives and found no record of a Major König, and no German records mention him, while no sniper school director went missing in Stalingrad. Different novels and accounts give different names, like Heinz Thorwald or Hermann Stoff, and the details change depending on who's telling the story. So why does it matter when, even if the duel was fiction, the propaganda value was real? The Soviet Union needed heroes, and needed stories that proved their soldiers could beat the supposedly invincible Wehrmacht, and they needed hope. Vasily Zaitsev, whether he dueled a legendary German sniper or not, provided that hope. The truth shows Zaitsev did hunt and kill 11 German snipers during the Battle of Stalingrad, and that's documented. Whether one of them was a master sniper sent specifically to kill him remains unknown. But in war, sometimes the myth carries as much power as the reality. German soldiers believed Zaitsev was out there hunting them, believed he was unkillable, and that fear proved as deadly as any bullet. But Vasily Zaitsev wasn't content with just killing Germans himself because he wanted to multiply his effectiveness, and that's when, in the middle of the Battle of Stalingrad, surrounded by death, he did something remarkable by opening a school. A bombed-out metal hardware factory became home to Zaitsev's training program for Soviet snipers, and his students were called the Zaitchata, the little hares, which was a play on his name since Zayets means hare in Russian. The little hares would learn from the master hare how to hunt wolves. Brutal training ran through the curriculum because this wasn't a classroom, but survival training in an active war zone. Students would spend entire days lying motionless in ruins, just observing German positions through their scopes without shooting, just watching and learning enemy patterns while building patience. Zaitsev once ordered his students to remain still in a destroyed warehouse all day studying enemy movements, with no bathroom breaks, no food, no water, just observation, because one moment of impatience would get you killed. Camouflage techniques, how to select firing positions, how to calculate windage and distance, how to recognize the different types of enemy snipers. All of this he taught them, but most important came the psychology of sniping, because this wasn't just marksmanship, but mental warfare. Around 28 direct students received personal training from Zaitsev, but his methods spread throughout the Red Army, and trained hundreds more. Tanya Chernova stood as the most famous of his students, a young woman who became both his student and his lover. And she killed over 80 Germans, while other students racked up dozens or hundreds of kills each. Collectively, the snipers trained by Vasily Zaitsev killed more than 6,000 enemy soldiers during World War II. 6,000 deaths from the multiplier effect that proved staggering, because one man with a rifle and a philosophy of patience had created an army of ghosts. Disaster struck in January 1943, when Zaitsev moved through a contested sector and a German mortar round exploded nearby. Shrapnel tore through the air and fragments hit his face, hit his eyes, and the world went dark. Vasily Zaitsev, the man with the keenest eyes in the Soviet Union, had gone blind. Moscow received him in critical condition after evacuation, and for most soldiers this would have been the end. But the Red Army wasn't about to lose their greatest propaganda asset. Professor Vladimir Filatov arrived, one of the world's pioneering ophthalmologists, and a founder of corneal transplant techniques who had established the Institute of Eye Diseases and Tissue Therapy in Odessa and was revolutionizing eye surgery. The operation ran delicate and experimental while weeks passed with Zaitsev lying in a hospital bed, uncertain if he'd ever see again. February 22nd. In 1943 brought the Hero of the Soviet Union Award while he was still recovering, the highest honor the USSR could bestow. And he'd become a living legend, a symbol of resistance, proof that the Red Army could not only match the Wehrmacht, but surpass it. Recovery didn't mean retirement, because when Zaitsev healed, he returned to the front lines, continued training snipers and sharing his knowledge, but also took on new roles. Commanding a mortar platoon came first, then an entire rifle regiment, and he fought across Ukraine, at the Dnieper River, in Odessa, pushing the Germans back toward their homeland. April 1945 found Captain Vasily Zaitsev at the Battle of Silo Heights, one of the last major battles before Berlin, and the war was nearly over with Nazi Germany collapsing. But on May 9, 1945, Victory Day, when Soviet soldiers celebrated in the streets, Zaitsev was back in a hospital with 7 wounds in a body that had endured more than any man should. Survival through the deadliest war in human history marked his greatest achievement. What Vasily Zaitsev did after the war might surprise you because he disappeared, not literally, but by stepping away from the spotlight. Kiev became his new home, where he enrolled in a textile university and studied engineering, and the man who had killed over 300 enemy soldiers became a factory director working in textiles while living quietly. But the wounds never fully healed, because 7 major injuries sustained during the war plagued him for the rest of his life. Shrapnel in his eyes occasionally caused problems while his body bore scars that would never fade. And yet he rarely complained because he'd seen too many men die to pity himself. 2 books came from his pen, Notes of a Sniper and For Us There Was No Land Beyond the Volga, and both became essential reading for military snipers. His tactical innovations, his philosophy, his techniques, they were studied by armies around the world, while the Six's tactics saw use in Chechnya, and modern Russian snipers still learn from his principles. December 15, 1991, brought Vasily Zaitsev's death at the age of 76, and that was 11 days before the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The country he'd fought for, bled for, killed for, was about to cease to exist, and they buried him in Kiev. But it wasn't what he wanted. Zaitsev had made one final request, asking to be buried in Stalingrad, in the land he had defended, among the men who had died beside him. But for years, that wish went unfulfilled. His grave remained in Kiev, far from the battlefield where he'd become a legend. January 31, 2006 arrived 63 years after the Battle of Stalingrad ended, and Vasily Zaitsev finally came home. His remains were exhumed and transported to Volgograd, the city formerly known as Stalingrad, and with full military honors he was reburied at Mamayev Kurgan, the massive memorial complex that dominates the city. 35,000 defenders of Stalingrad rest there, and now Zaitsev rests among them. The monument bears his words carved in stone. For us, there was no land beyond the Volga. So what's the legacy? And what does Vasily Zaitsev mean 80 years after Stalingrad ended? Numbers tell part of the story, with over 300 confirmed kills. In 225 in Stalingrad alone, 11 enemy snipers eliminated, and 6,000 enemy soldiers killed by his students. One man transformed Soviet sniper doctrine and created a legacy that outlived the country he served. But numbers don't capture the psychological impact because German soldiers in Stalingrad were terrified to raise their heads. Officers stopped wearing rank insignia because it made them targets, while snipers stopped using their scopes in certain areas because the glint might attract Zaitsev's attention, and the fear was real. And fear in war can be as effective as bullets. Stalingrad itself marked the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front, where the myth of German invincibility shattered. 750,000 Axis soldiers died alongside 1.1 million Soviets in the bloodiest battle in human history, and in the middle of that hell, one sniper with a rifle showed that individual skill, patience, and and intelligence could change the course of battles. Zaitsev's story spread far beyond military circles when the 2001 film Enemy at the Gates, starring Jude Law, brought his story to millions worldwide. Video games featured him as a character while books, documentaries, and graphic novels followed, turning him into a cultural icon. But the problem was Hollywood blurred the line between fact and fiction. Romantic subplots, the dramatized duel with König, the simplified narrative, they made good cinema, but questionable history. The real Zaitsev ran more complex as a peasant who became a clerk who became a killer. And he was a man who understood that war wasn't glorious, but necessary. Killing wasn't something he enjoyed, but something he excelled at. And there's a difference. His writings emphasize discipline, preparation, intelligence, not bloodlust, not heroism, just competence. And that competence changed how modern militaries think about snipers, because before World War II, snipers were often seen as lone wolves, individual marksmen operating independently. Zaitsev proved that snipers could work in teams, could be trained systematically, could be integrated into larger tactical frameworks, and the Six's formation anticipated modern sniper-spotter partnerships and fireteam tactics. Every major military in the world today trains snipers using principles Zaitsev helped develop, principles like patience, camouflage, psychological warfare, and target prioritization. The understanding that a sniper's job isn't just to kill, but to disrupt, demoralize, and create chaos in enemy ranks came from his teachings. But perhaps the most important part of Zaitsev's legacy shows what he represented to the Soviet people during their darkest hour. Fall of 1942 saw Nazi Germany seeming unstoppable after conquering most of Europe, sitting at the gates of Moscow, besieging Leningrad, and pushing into the Caucasus, which made defeat seem inevitable. And that's when stories arrived of a hunter from Siberia who wouldn't yield, a man who turned the ruins of a city into a hunting ground where the hunter became the hunted. Every confirmed kill got reported, while every dead German sniper became a propaganda victory, and Zaitsev became proof that the Red Army could fight back, could win, could turn the tide. When Stalingrad held, and when the German Sixth Army got encircled and forced to surrender in February 1943, it wasn't just a military victory, but a psychological earthquake. Germany was beatable, and snipers like Zaitsev had helped make that clear. Vasily Zaitsev died as the Soviet Union was collapsing, But his legend endures, not because he was the deadliest sniper in history, since Finnish sniper Simo Heiha had more confirmed kills at over 500, not because he was the most skilled, since many snipers achieved remarkable feats, but because Zaitsev represented something larger. Transformation defined him as a clerk who became a warrior, a hunter who became a teacher, a man who took the lessons of the Siberian wilderness and applied them to the most brutal urban combat in human history. Intelligence and patience could defeat superior numbers and firepower, and he proved it. In the end, Vasily Zaitsev turned Stalingrad into a death trap not through overwhelming force, but through making every shadow dangerous, every pile of rubble a potential grave, every moment of carelessness fatal. The ruins became his forest, while the Germans became his wolves. And just like in his childhood, one shot was all he needed. For the Soviet Union, there truly was no land beyond the Volga, and they would hold Stalingrad or die trying. Vasily Zaitsev, with a rifle and iron will, made sure the Germans died trying to take it. The hunter from the Urals had come to the city of steel and turned it into his hunting ground, and the wolves never saw him coming.